was in before the cutoff somehow finished the right one. I'm like, how finished the right one? There's 5 different ones it could have been. Something sneaky's going on. Test 1 2. Test 1. I got snapped that. Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Test 1 2. It's working. Would you like to try something?
Hello.
Hello. Yep. Okay. Would you like? Okay, I'll start.
You say streaming or streaming? Oh, streaming. Yeah, perhaps.
Professor Tesla, did you want to do this part? Never held a microphone.
You can start by saying the views expressed do not necessarily.
The views expressed do not necessarily. Well, hello everyone. Welcome. In case we have not met, my name is Jeremy Denton. I currently serve as the department chair for math. I've been here for 9 years at SU. I love SU. But tonight is not about me. I'd like to thank Professor Allman for his organization on our Torch Talks and bringing in different speakers with different backgrounds, with different topics, just to talk to our students. Tonight we have Dr. Joe Davis, which I've talked to a few times. We formally met a few minutes ago. So I don't want to take any more of the time away. I'd like to turn it over to him. So if we could give him a wonderful welcome to our CNHS building.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Well, it's great to be with you all. And I think it was last year. Was it last year I was here? Yeah, okay. So enjoyable, absolutely enjoyed it. And asked if I would present on a very controversial topic called the Shroud of Turin. And I would love to do that. And before we do, let's turn to our scriptures because, of course, this is what the Shroud is all about. And so let's go ahead and turn to John 20, and we're going to look at verse 1. John 20, verse 1. John 20, verse 1. You can turn to it, and for those of you who have memorized it, no need to turn. John 20, verse 1. And it reads like this. Early on the first day of the week, when it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb, and both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and got to the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. And finally, the other disciple had reached the tomb, also went inside. He saw and believed. He still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about one of the most controversial and interesting topics in archaeology and Christianity. It's an issue of science, issue of faith. It's an issue of just how do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? Everybody who I've ever read or had anything to say about the Shroud always begins with this. Our faith is not built upon an object. Our faith is built in the risen Christ. And so the risen Christ is in what we believe. However, having said that, there's been a whole lot of information coming out about what is called the Shroud of Turin. You have it on the picture screen in front of you. This is the shroud itself. Well, first, let's start. What is a shroud? You could say that, in fact, that the shroud itself is shrouded in mystery. Never mind. So the shroud is a burial cloth. And the idea behind this is that this is the burial cloth that Jesus was buried in. Now, needless to say, if that's true, oh my golly, I mean, can you find anything better? I mean, that's about as good as it gets. And so we see in this, if you're able to, the figure of a man. Now, this figure was created through a negative of a photograph, actually. And it was created a long time ago, long after the history of the Shroud had attained some significance. Secondo Pia, in 1898, created this image. When he said created, he would say found this image. And so what is it that people say, and how should we proceed? Well, a lot has been said. And some of it is new information, and some of it's not so new. And so what is the new information? Well, they have found that there is some limestone that is on the Shroud that is consistent with limestone that is found in Jerusalem itself. And it would not be a stretch to say that the limestone on the Shroud comes from Jerusalem. However, you might say, is it provable that that's the only limestone in the world? Well, let's just start right there, just with one of the questions. The second assertion is that this figure is part of the power of the Holy Spirit that has imprinted the image of Jesus prior to the resurrection or at the moment of the resurrection. And the explosive power of the Holy Spirit has imprinted the image of Jesus and the face of Jesus on the shroud. Now, again, what is a shroud? The shroud is a burial cloth. And so the idea behind it is that Jesus is wrapped in this burial cloth. When he rises from the dead, there is a burst of energy, the likes of which perhaps we have not seen. I wouldn't say it that strongly, perhaps, if I was thinking long and hard about it, because it would have annihilated the cloth itself. So we would just say that it is a burst of energy that leaves a radioactive impression, just to give you an example of how this would work. If you've ever seen Nagasaki or Hiroshima videos, in fact, there are outlines of bodies as a result of the blast. In other words, there's nothing left of the body. And what the force of the blast creates a picture, I guess you could say, of the outline of the body. And so you can tell right where people died, because the outline of their body is imprinted in stones in Hiroshima, steps, buildings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the idea is, it's the same thing, that in fact you have the impression of something that has such power to it, that in fact it leaves a facsimile of Jesus of Nazareth in this burial cloth. Well, to be sure, that's kind of interesting stuff. And it is so interesting that it began to attract scientists. And so before we get to some of the scientific studies, let me give you a little bit of the history. And I'm going to say right away, the history might be where we have some of the problem. What do I mean? Well, we first begin to hear of this garment, this shroud, in the Middle Ages. We do not hear much of anything about it prior to the Middle Ages. And that creates a little bit of a concern. Why? Number one, there is not one shroud, just in case you're wondering. There were four. Okay? And so you say, well, which one's the real one? Now, effectively, all the other ones have been dismissed. And so this is the only one that's in contention for being legitimate. And so the other ones, not so much. Just to give you a little background so that you understand historically how all of this works. Anything associated with Jesus' crucifixion or resurrection was of high monetary value and high spiritual value. What do I mean? Well, during the Middle Ages, they began to talk about something called indulgences. And around the 11th century, we get the doctrine of purgatory really begins to make a strong appearance. Some might have alluded to it in earlier church history, But now we get a very, very strong idea of purgatory. The result of that is that, in fact, people believed that if you had a relic, a holy relic, it would take years off of your time in purgatory. Now, it was assumed that all of you were going there, just to be clear. And guess, just in case you think that this is an old doctrine, not so fast. Cardinal Ratzinger, who became the Pope prior to this Pope, okay, he said that we must uphold the doctrine of purgatory because people must work out their unresolved guilt. And that is to be done in purgatory. Now, some have thought while taking my midterms that they were doing that very thing. That, in fact, they had reached a level of purgatory. And they did not know why such things had happened to them, but it clearly was a judgment of God. Well, because purgatory was a big deal, and pretty much people believed it. And when I say people, it is being propagated by the papacy. In other words, it isn't just a common folklore that people are given to, or some mythology that some people just might, because they don't know any better, give credence to. No, this is being told by the popes and the heads of the Catholic Church. And so if you had anything associated with a saint, that's years off of purgatory. And the idea behind this is the bigger the saint, the more years. See? Meaning, if you have some saint that nobody's ever heard of, that might get you a little bit, that might get you 100 years off. But by golly, you're going to be there a long time. You're going to need some help. And so it was not uncommon for rich people and kings to buy up as many relics as they could so they could be just as evil as they wanted to be. You see? Wasn't that great? Yeah. As a matter of fact, it's like you could purchase your way into heaven. By the way, it's called a heresy called simony. And so what occurs is that this practice persists. What do we know about this practice? If anything's considered a holy relic, the greater it is, the closer it is to Jesus and the crucifixion, well, it goes way, way up there. And so by the time we're done, we have, if you put all the pieces of wood together, like 75 crosses. You have lots of shrouds. You have lots of things that would be considered holy relics. If we took all the nails that were sold as holy relics, we could easily build a battleship. And so what I'm trying to tell you is what you already know and you can figure out. There are snake oil salesmen that sometimes come along in religion. I know, you might say to me, say it ain't so, Dr. Davis. But it is. And so they saw a chance to make a profit, and they did. And one of the arguments actually against, if you ever get to go to Israel, we hope and pray that it will be soon, that in fact, the new tomb, which is called the Garden Tomb, probably can't be the real place because it actually looks like the Golgotha that we read about. You say, well, that's counterintuitive, Dr. Davis. That doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, if it looks like it, well, probably it's the place. No, just the opposite. Because you see, everybody and their mom literally wants a piece of the rock. And so they're chipping away at it. They're taking some home. And particularly when you have relics that will take thousands of years off of purgatory. And if you got something from the resurrection or the cross or anything like that, you're good. You're good. And so this became a big business. Again, you may not know this, but this is how the Reformation started, actually. And what occurs is a young monk by the name of Martin Luther comes along, and he hears a gentleman by the name of John Tetzel selling indulgences with this little ditty, put a little money in the can, and thousands of years go off purgatory, something along those lines. It's not really a ditty in English, but anyway, that's the idea. Luther is outraged. He is like beside himself what in the world are you doing? And he writes a letter to the Pope saying, you know, people are doing really bad things in your name. They're selling holy relics to get years off of purgatory. And by the way, wouldn't that mean that people can actually purchase their salvation? And wouldn't that mean that the rich are the ones who are going to get into heaven when the Bible seems to say just the opposite? And how can this be so, Most Holy Father? Surely this is something that you were not made aware of. Well, Pope was aware of it because he commissioned it. And so what did he do? He responded to Luther by saying, turn yourself in so we can kill you. Well, you know, that always makes your day, you know. Yeah, that always makes you feel better. And so they posted images of Luther, which under it said dead or alive. Luther decided he would not turn himself in, and rather he would in fact start a church. And there we go, we have the Reformation, and we're off to the races. Well, how about the Shroud of Turin? We have lots of shrouds making their appearances all over the place. And why is this shroud given so much attention? All right, well, I'll tell you the story. So in iconography, which is imagery, and in the Greek Orthodox Church particularly, what people would do is they would create images, which was in itself a controversy because we do have this Old Testament passage in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt make no graven images of anything in heaven above, earth below, or I'm pretty sure we're definitely talking about God. Some have debated whether it means anything, but no question when it comes to God, it definitely means that. And it was a controversy because people would make images of Jesus. And an image of Jesus that was found in Odessa seems to be very similar to the image that we have on the shroud. And so the theory behind it is that this image was the image on the shroud, and that the shroud was in Odessa. And by the time it finally comes to Turin, what has occurred is that we have confirmation of the same image in Odessa as we do in Turin. Now, criticisms of that. I've looked at the imagery and I just have to say it like this. The shroud looks like a Middle Eastern man or a Mediterranean person with long hair. The image from Odessa looks like a Mediterranean person with long hair and a beard, okay, the whole deal. Is that proof that in fact it's the same image? Truthfully, it's a stretch. And here's why. There's just a whole bunch of people that look like that, okay? I mean, if you go to the Middle East, you're gonna see a whole bunch of people that have that appearance. And by the way, it's not real great picture. In other words, it's not like we take a camera shot today. I mean, this is something that we get through a negative of a photograph. So I'm not so sure I want to make that leap that this is the image in Odessa. Now, for people who believe in the Shroud of Turin's authenticity, they are going to say the history of the shroud is from Odessa to Turin and up to present. Okay, maybe. For people who don't believe it, they're going to say, well, that isn't true at all. The imagery that we have in Odessa is of someone who looks similar to the Turin, but truthfully, it's just a Middle Eastern man. It's not definitive. Okay. Well, how did the shroud do once it comes over to Europe, supposedly? The answer is not real well. And I think that when we're listening to the shroud and talk about the shroud, and I know that we need to get into the science before we're done, but the history itself is not real great. And what I mean by this is that, in fact, there are no signs of decomposition on the shroud at all. Not good. In other words, if it's a burial cloth, don't people decompose? Pretty sure. Are there any signs? No. Is there human DNA in the shroud? Yes. Lots of it. Approximately 95 different DNA samples have come from the shroud. Now, your question is, well, couldn't one of them be Jesus? Theoretically, yes. But we have 94 other people that we need to account for. By the way, do all of the DNA come from the Middle East? No. Some does. The majority comes from Europe, which makes sense because it's in European hands, quite literally, a lot. We actually have DNA from India on it. And you're like, well, did the shroud go to India? Well, here's the simple answer. We don't really know where it was for close to 1,250 years. Now, I'm going to say that's a giant strike right there. Because if, in fact, you lost track of it and now you found it, where was it? Didn't anybody specifically look at the shroud and say, hey, this is it. This is the shroud. Well, the gap to the 13th century is significant. But once we get to the 13th and 14th century, tremendous controversy arises. Not in the scientific community, but in the Catholic Church. In other words, if you're thinking that this is something that Catholicism has supported as soon as it makes its appearance, just the opposite. Let me say that again. If you think the Catholic Church has grabbed hold of this relic and said, this is the burial cloth of Jesus, no, just the opposite. Recently, it has appeared a little bit more important. Well, what is the history? Well, it really doesn't make it to the chapel of Turin for a while. It goes through north central France, evidently, and the Bishop of Troyes in 1389 declared it to be a forgery. In fact, the bishop said that he wrote a lengthy letter to Clement VII, who was one of the popes, not to get into church history, during the three-pope episode called the Babylonian Captivity, where you have three popes all excommunicating each other, and not exactly a shining moment in church history. But one of the popes he writes a letter to saying that he knew the man who created it, and that in fact it is a work of art, and that the artist who painted it could be known, and it was ingeniously painted so that in fact people would think that it really was the real thing, and that he used paint to mark where the nail prints of Jesus would have been, and also the foot of Jesus, that paint was applied there. And so from the very beginning, there is all sorts of questions that begin to occur as it relates to the shroud. Now, what has made it, and probably I should say sort of current? In 1390, the Pope that I mentioned, Clement VII, issued a papal bull. And he said, I want to put an end to all of the fraud. And I want to say as clearly as I can that the Shroud of Turin is a forgery. It is not authentic, and it is not the shroud of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now you might say, okay, well, that's it, we're done. Not so fast. In 1506, another pope comes along named Julius, and he reverses the decision, and he says, well, actually, it is authentic. Now you might wonder, well, on what basis do they make this decision? And I don't know, but he said that it is to be venerated and it can have its own mass. For those of you who are not aware, you could have a mass for a holy relic. And so it's sort of held in abeyance until we get to 1936, and Pope Pius XII calls the shroud a holy thing like nothing else. And he approves devotion to it as the face of Jesus. In 1998, Pope John Paul II said that the shroud is a distinguished relic and a mirror of the gospel. Okay? But Pope Benedict, who we talked about, said it is an icon written with the blood of a whipped man and a crown of thorns, crucified and pierced. And in 2013, Pope Francis referred to it as an icon of a crucified man. Now, that doesn't sound like a tremendous, how shall we say, confirmation or advocation. But Pope Francis did do a pilgrimage to Turin in 2015 to pray before the shroud and to venerate it. So that does look like he's giving it a little bit of homage and believing it to be the real thing. So what occurs and why our present discussion? Well, a discovery was made of flora and pollen, and it's said that in fact, the flora and pollen were from the Middle East and from the 1st century. Now you've got people interested, because truthfully, most people are going to go, relic. We have plenty of relics. Not a big deal. But now people are going, well, now you've added a little bit of science to it. Now you've got our attention. To what degree? To the degree that the Vatican decided to allow it to be radiocarbon tested. The radiocarbon testing from 3 different universities all came back with the same dating. They were done separately, and the radiocarbon dating showed it to be from 1260 to 1390, within that range. And in fact, they said unequivocally, there is no support for radiocarbon dating. Different researchers came along and said, well, I don't think that you factored in all of the evidence, including the floral and the pollen. Therefore, your radiocarbon dating is wrong. When a scientist is told his radiocarbon dating is wrong, generally he just dismisses it altogether and says, you don't know what you're talking about. To try to solve the issue, a number of scientific communities offered to do another radiocarbon dating. And it does get a little bit problematic, because I'm going to tell you that there is a gentleman who just recently came out with a book who says it's not that radiocarbon dating is flawed, it's their method that's flawed. Well, what do you mean? Well, the Shroud of Turin had been mended numerous times. And so the idea behind it was that all you were really doing is doing a radiocarbon dating on something that was from another time that was the mending of the Shroud of Turin. See what I'm saying? In other words, he said, I'm not saying your radiocarbon dating is wrong. What I'm saying is you tested the wrong area. Now it's getting even more complicated. And so were there patches done numerous times on the Shroud? Yes. Is it possible they're right? Perhaps. And so the solution was, well, give us the Shroud of Turin again, and we'll do another radiocarbon testing on it. At this point, the Catholic Church says, nope, we're done with that. And they make a statement saying the Shroud of Turin is an object of faith and a holy relic and is not subject to destruction. What do you mean? In order to do the radiocarbon dating, you're going to have to burn it to destroy it to be able to come up with that measurement. And so the Catholic Church says, you destroyed enough of it. We're not getting any more of it. It's a holy relic. That's it. We're done. for people who were suspicious, their conclusion was, you don't want us to do it because, in fact, you know it's going to create the same result. Those who believed in it, some actually do want it to be tested again to see. And others will say, well, it doesn't have anything to do with its legitimacy, because even the carbon dating itself only gave us a 95% confirmation rate, meaning there's a 5% chance that it's wrong. Now, for most people who are scientists, 95% wins. But you see the problem there. I imagine, let's see, we have our mathematician here. 95% is not 100%, I believe. Yes, okay, all right, we have confirmation on that. In other words, what they were trying to say is this doesn't add up. Never mind. So the Catholic Church said, that's it, we're done. We're done. Okay, all right, no more radiocarbon dating. So now what can we look? So in 1998, there was a re-looking at the shroud as to the weave. Interestingly enough, the weave is consistent with weaves that were done in India. Interesting. And the weave in the Shroud of Turin is not consistent with weaving that was done in first century Palestine or Israel. Well, there is an argument against that too, though, by the way. And the argument is, by the way, people went to India and it could have come from India, and it doesn't have to come from the Middle East to be Jesus's burial cloth. I'm not so sure. The Jewish people are kind of particular about what they're going to bury people in. It's kind of a big deal. And so that seems to raise the question. Microscopist Walter Macron won a Nobel Prize for his work on the shroud. What did he do? He began to look at the chemistry of the shroud and to look at different aspects of red pigment, i.e. blood, supposedly. He took some tape as to not really harm the shroud and pick up some DNA from this red pigmentation. He examined it, and all of it he diagnosed as being vermilion pigment, or very basically, simply put, paint. In other words, of all of the red pigmentation that he got from the shroud, not one was a blood sample. All of it was paint, which is exactly what was said by the bishop who appealed to Clement, that in fact an artist had done very, very good work. It is also true that they investigated more the plant taxonomy, and they looked at all the different things that were there. And again, similar to human DNA, you're going to find just all sorts of stuff. Like what? They found marine worm DNA from Canada. Okay. And they found 19 different plant types, some home to North Africa, Central Europe, obviously, Mediterranean countries, and the Middle East. So was it true that they found pollen and plant life from the Middle East? Yes. But we must take it in context. They also found the same thing from Canada. What does this mean? It means that it's definitely not conclusive that the plant life is, in fact, the only thing they would found. Or to put it another way, if it's been around for 2,000 years, it's likely that you're going to find all sorts of DNA from plants from all over. Now, Brown came out with something, and he's a famous theologian, and he said that, in fact, a corpse had been found in a relaxed position, and they examined the corpse. And the reason for this is because in the picture of the shroud, the hands are over the genitalia. I'm sorry to make you uncomfortable with this if I do, but the Roman practice of crucifixion was to crucify people in the nude. It was not true that there were loincloths around anybody who was being crucified. The whole point of the crucifixion was pain and humiliation. And so the Roman crucifixion is a PR campaign designed to make people think twice about what they are doing. So for those who believe that the shroud is legitimate, they believe that the carbon-14 testing does not really tell us anything because, in fact, there's all sorts of things that were done to the shroud that might have thrown people off. The only way to resolve that issue would be to test a part which, in fact, would be considered original. That will not happen. And so where does this leave us? According to the studies that I've read, all of the blood that is seen in the shroud is, in fact, paint. There is not any blood that we know of. Also, Ray Brown said the picture of the man covering his genitalia is inconsistent with the length of people's arms. And so Jesus's arms would have had to been much longer in order to make that length in the shroud. I don't know if that's conclusive evidence, but I give it to you anyway. So at this point, the only thing that I think that the shroud does have going for it is the question, how did the image appear? Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. It was a pretty fine work, whatever that person did, if they did a forgery. I mean, somewhat amazing. Because the image is interesting in and of itself. There's some inconsistencies with the image. The blood doesn't seem to be blood. And for that reason, it sure looks like a forgery since paint is placed where the blood is supposed to be. The limestone that was found, interesting. I'll grant it that too. Can it be explained? Sure. We got worm DNA from Canada, so we can get limestone from Israel. And so, Dr. Davis, what do you believe? I'm generally a person not to give my opinion. That was a joke. But I think that the scriptures tell us before we ever looked what the truth of the shroud is. And so this is where we began. And I'll read it to you again. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb, and both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And he bent over and he looked at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb, and he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus's head. I don't know if you heard it. That which was the imprint of his head is on a different cloth. And so if you have a cloth that has both his head and his feet and his hands, it is not the burial cloth of Jesus. Because the scriptures tell us very clearly that there are a napkin that held his head and the burial cloth. If we're getting a resurrection making an imprint, that imprints primarily on the napkin. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Well, we do have a little bit of time for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free. I'll be more than happy to answer to the best of my ability. If you would like to have a joke, I can do that also, or a witty pun. I might. Sure, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Right. Yeah. Go ahead, please, go ahead. No, what I'm saying is there is not any evidence at all of decomposition on the burial shroud, and if it has a dead body in it, for sure you got decomposition. Okay? When I'm saying decomposition, I'm not talking about the essays that I read on my exams. Paxton. Yes. No, it's interesting because they're sort of equivocating, okay? And basically, a lot of the popes have come out, if you listen very carefully, they're not saying it's the real thing. They're saying Ratzinger, Pope Ratzinger says, well, this is the image of a man who was crucified. He didn't say it was Jesus. Now, he's leaving it open, so you can go, wow, maybe it is Jesus. Maybe it is. By the way, there's a number of Catholic theologian scientists who do not believe the shroud to be legitimate because of everything that I've shared with you. And I think the most damaging aspects of this is that, in fact, there's no question that where the blood is supposed to be, we got paint. And we don't have any decomposition. What does that mean? If you die, you're going to decompose. And that's how that works. So you got to have evidence of that. By the way, even so, I read another article on just the blood itself, and they said even the way that it's on the shroud, it would not be the way that blood would run basically down. It does not have that symmetry. Now, when you look at that, you're like, it would seem to me blood could have lots of different options, But they were convinced no. That wasn't as strong an argument for me, but anyway, the no decomposition is a pretty strong one. Yeah. Yes, Pat.
So obviously, no DNA on it. But could we just?
Well, no. Lots of DNA.
No blood, sorry.
Yeah.
Could we discuss Jesus' DNA itself?
Okay, now this is a funny little aspect. This is a funny little aspect to the shroud itself. I read a geneticist article 20 years ago, and what he said is, I sure hope that this really is the shroud of Jesus, and we can take some DNA samples and we can clone another Jesus. This is true. I read that, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to say it's not going to be the real one, even if you could. Yeah. So what is your question?
So, like the logistics behind Jesus' birth being only maternal DNA from Mary versus the other chromosome, like
a controversy in and of itself. No, it's and an easy one. I shouldn't say easy. Interesting. There's a controversy in the church of a term called Theotokos, Mother of God. Doesn't sound great. How can someone be the Mother of God? Can't be the Mother of God. Anyway, the church stuck with that to acknowledge the church's belief that Jesus' humanity comes through Mary. Now, is that our only option? Actually, no. Karl Barth says that Mary is the conduit. And just as God is able to create Adam, he doesn't need any human help. See? Now, if you think about it, well, of course that's true. It isn't like he's, needing Mary's help at all. Clearly, that's going to push Mary's standing a little bit down. Okay. And Karl Barth is a Presbyterian Reformed theologian. And so he's not going for the whole Mary's the mother of Jesus. No. He's saying the humanity of Christ is the work of God in totality. Not in any way is Mary the mother of God. There is an issue with that. And I'm going to say I disagree with Karl Barth. And there's lots and lots of issues with that. Number one, I don't know if this was your question, but since I teach on this for hours on end, one of the issues is how much is he really like us if he's a pristine human as opposed to a human with human DNA through Mary? Because Mary's DNA is flawed. Now, the Catholic Church has heard you, to which they responded, no, it's not. Well, okay, Jesus doesn't get original sin because Mary never had it. You say, well, where'd you get that in the Bible? Well, it's tradition. I see. Whose tradition? Ours. So I'm not trying to, I don't agree with it, obviously, but it isn't, I'm going to say God has the option. He can create Jesus without Mary, no question about it. That's not really an issue, but it's more an issue to fulfill the scriptures because it specifically says that the seed of David will inherit an everlasting kingdom. And so that's biology that we're talking there. And so it's the throne of David. Now you could say, well, he's adopted into the house of David. And yet I think I do like the biology that is actually being referenced there, meaning, no, he's going to have human DNA and he's going to be a human.
I have a few things, just because I was really able to hear about that. One, I was thinking about the paint thing.
Yeah.
And I was trying to put together that with your idea that they really wanted relics.
Sure.
Now, could you imagine someone at that time finding this, assuming it was authentic, and saying, I'm going to paint that on there to make it look better?
Sure is the answer to your question.
Okay.
Is that possible? Sure.
It sounded like it was how important it was to them. Like I said, I knew you painted the photo.
Sure. Is it possible? Absolutely.
Second thing, the Sudarium of Oviedo. Oviedo, you know that?
No, I'm unfamiliar with that.
So this was one it always got me with this. It's apparently the face wrap of Jesus.
Oh, I know it. Okay.
And again, I'm sure you know, I'm hoping you knew more about this, but from what I have heard, it matches up very well with the Shroud of Turin. The injuries and where.
Yeah, the problem is the Shroud of Turin is itself a whole unit.
Right. I heard someone explain something on that, was that they very possibly could have covered his face while they were getting him off the cross for dignity, then gave him a proper burial, but since that had his blood on it, they left it in the tomb.
To me, that would be a stretch.
I don't know Jewish custom.
Yeah, and here's why I would say it'd be a stretch. If they're going to cover any part, it's not going to be his head. Okay. They're going to cover his genitalia.
Think so?
Yep. Yeah, I'll tell you why.
Or maybe they didn't.
Huh?
Or maybe they didn't. They didn't say that.
Well, that's correct. Could it be that? I think it's more probable, and again, we're talking in probability here, which, like I said, 95% on the carbon-14 is 95%. So is it most probable? No, I think most probable is that, in fact, they're probably not real concerned as to dignity at this point because he's been up on the cross naked for a long period of time. I say long period of time, less than a half day, but he's already been on the cross naked, and he's bloodied beyond recognition almost. And so I'm not really sure where the dignity would come in, because they'd have to cover the whole thing without question right then. Now, they might have, okay? They might have been able to do that. But for me, the thing that makes the most, not most sense, that I think is scriptural, is that in fact, the scriptures seem to indicate there are two. And so the one that is covering his head would not be an addition to the shroud. In other words, it's a separate entity. Right, right. Yeah. In other words, let's even say for a second that they covered his whole body. Well, what would be the point of putting something else over his head if his whole body's covered?
Well, I think their argument was, while they were getting the nails out of him, getting off the cross, someone stuck this cloth over his face.
That's even farther a stretch for me.
So,
Yeah.
I really don't know their practice of that.
Yeah. Okay. So it isn't. Yeah. So to be fair, it isn't all that high up. Here we're getting all sorts of interesting stuff. So Jesus is not crucified on a hill far away. That's a song. Okay. And it's a sorry. And it's a great song. It's a nice song. But the whole purpose of the Roman crucifixion was to be on a major thoroughfare and to be accessible to the public. And this, I'm sorry, I hate to tell you this, but this is what the cross is. So that people could spit on you, so that people could do whatever they wanted to you as they're passing by. And it was a form of entertainment, brutality, as well as humiliation. And so when they're taking him down off the cross, I would be surprised that they're trying to get up to his head, because number one, you're going to have to get on something. I think they'd be more concerned with just getting him down as quickly as possible. And in fact, the scriptures tell us that they are in a hurry to move into the tomb. Now, you could say, well, how long does it really take to put something on his head? Agreed. But if they put it on his head, why are they going to take it off? But even so, that's not what the scriptures teach. The scriptures teach us. Well, but no matter how many times they put and the answer to your question is yes, it would be highly unlikely that they're going to ruin two shrouds. And you say, well, it's the Lord.
Didn't also throw him in a pile of bodies in the back either. Was treated differently.
Well, that's a debated one, I'm going to tell you. That's highly debated. And here's why. Philo says that even the enemies of our corpses are buried. We have archaeological evidence of a man who was crucified and put into a cave. We have actually a number of them. The nail through the and the nail through the heel. We actually have a heel bone of Yokoam that was found, and the nail's still in it. And so this is proof positive that all people who are executed as criminals are not going to be thrown into a ditch just for common burial. The third point along those lines is our greatest historian from the time, Josephus, says that it is not our custom to allow the dead to be out, but it is our custom to bury them immediately. How so? I'll give you an example. Even in Israel today, one of my guides had someone die in his family. That person was buried within 4 hours. Why? The Jewish custom, I'm not saying it's biblical, okay? I'm not saying it's biblical. The Jewish custom is that the soul is imprisoned in the body until such time as it's buried. And so there's, in Israel, even today, quick burials. And they're not waiting a week to bury someone as quickly as can be done. And so I think that the haste and the speed are more important in their minds. Now, again, you say, well, it doesn't take long to put up, something on their head. I agree. I'm just not sure that, well, number one, there's nothing in the scriptures telling us that. Granted, that doesn't mean it doesn't occur. However, I'm not sure why they would do it. I guess.
Was Mary still there when they took him down?
Yep.
Might have been.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, all four gospels reference Joseph of Arimathea, who immediately goes to Pilate, shocks Pilate, because Pilate thought the guy's already dead.
Yeah.
He should be up there longer, and grants him.
Yeah.
So there couldn't have been a lot of time for some of the Shroud to be on. He was trying to beat the deadline of Sabbath.
Yeah.
Get it all done before the Sabbath.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, the argument is it doesn't take long to put another head shroud. And I guess the argument, James, would be, well, since he's Jesus, we're going to give him more.
Right, and I don't want y'all to get me wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced really one way or the other on this.
Right.
These are questions that I've never been able to quite satisfactorily
Satisfy. Yeah.
And then the last one I have for you.
Sure.
All right. There's no decomposing body or material. Well, you could also maybe explain that with Jesus' resurrection.
I would say no to that one theologically.
Why is that?
Yeah. Okay. So Jesus is 100% human, 100% God. He must rise from the dead, meaning he's got to be dead. As soon as he's dead, decomposition begins to occur. He's in the ground for 3 days, and his divinity, while it is yet omnipresent, we are also told that he goes to the souls and preaches to the souls in prison. So his body is not animated by his spirit any more than any other place on the earth would be based upon his omnipresence.
That's not what I mean.
Okay.
I'm saying he started to decompose. There is something about the resurrection that removes any trace of that.
No, again, because put your hand in mine.
Right.
And
Was he
so,
still bleeding out of that one?
no, not
Like,
bleeding.
what's the healing?
He's keeping those wounds.
Right.
And
Maybe
so,
he kept those for a reason, but I'm not sure that
well, sure, I'm sure he did.
there is no law of conservation. No, only you can mistake there is. Sorry, there's not a law of conservation math. E equals MC squared. There not even a combination of it. It's a local conservation therapy, not a universal conservation. No, I'm saying it's
Yeah,
either
no.
or
Uh,
not to do what he wants.
Yeah, sure, of course.
No
Yeah,
part of it
sure.
is left on it. Might have been-
If you're asking, can God restore Jesus's body completely? Of course he can. Of course that's true. Okay, no doubt about it. But the shroud seems to indicate that in fact we're seeing the blood of Jesus on the shroud itself. So if we make the argument, well, there's no decomposition, why wouldn't God just make it all clean? Well, yeah, but we want to see, okay, so, but now it's getting a little bit harder, James, because the argument is we don't have any evidence, but we still believe it to be.
I'm saying I'm not certain that what I've ever seen says it can't.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's more an issue of possibility versus probability.
That's what I'm getting.
Yes. And if you're saying, is it possible? Of course. But the problem, what we get to with that is by the time we're done, we can argue that for pretty much everything.
Yes, but that's pretty much all we do in science, is whether or not. We never say definitively, or at least if we're with science, we never say definitively one way or the other. We do our very best to disprove, which is also probably what's coming out of me right now.
Yeah.
Because I have a list of questions that you've gone the other way with this.
Yeah.
To come back to it.
Yeah.
Is that my arguments always are, I'm gonna be counter to what you're saying.
Yeah. You picked the right person. You picked the right person.
My physics training or the reason I became a physicist.
No, as a matter of fact, I just taught in my apologetics class that all of science, forgive me, don't stone me, is based upon verifiability, which presupposes a constant in the universe, which cannot be proven. It must be presupposed. It is not possible that such a thing could occur. Therefore, everything is based upon a presupposition.
Even the presupposition that we are logical is one we cannot prove.
That is true. Cogito ergo sum presupposes the self.
Say that one again?
Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, presupposes the self. Yeah. Well, go ahead. One more question.
Mine was gonna be so easy. Scriptures indicate two separate cloths. So would this have even close to have been a burial cloth for anyone to see the head and the body?
Yes, it can be a very, yes, yeah. Yeah, and the question is, just simply, is there enough evidence to lean us on the probability side that it really is? Okay, I agree with James. God can do whatever he wants. But in this case, he'd have to overrule quite a few things. He'd have to overrule the weave itself. Now, what's the argument against that? Since my mind thinks this way too. The argument against it is, just because we haven't found it at this point doesn't mean that we won't in the future. Perhaps they did have more different weaves than, in fact, that we know of. And I'm tempted to write a book called Believe in the Weave. No, I'm sorry. Well, sure. I mean, is it possible? But the evidence is strongly looking at best, we have someone trying to paint over. Yeah, and aside from the scriptural evidence, one of the things that bothers me about this whole thing, in all honesty, is if someone really had the shroud of Jesus, the real one, why do we not hear more about it? Why are we waiting till 1290 before it really pops up? And I'm going to contrast that to something else. And the difference would be the shroud is movable, but we do have stuff that we can look at archaeology-wise and say, right here, this is the real thing. And when we get to like the tomb of Jesus, no one questions it, really. Well, I suppose someone does, but what I'm saying is, why? Well, because at the writing of the Gospels, we have it identified as the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, which means one of two things, which is really cool, by the way. I know you're like, all of this stuff. Okay, if you take something away from this, here it is. By saying the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, you're either writing the Gospels at a time when Joseph of Arimathea is alive, and people know him because he's become famous, or that tomb has already become a pilgrimage site. And we have confirmation of it because Adrian, the emperor, wished to basically stop people from going to these Christian pilgrimage sites. So he actually builds a temple to Aphrodite over the tomb of Christ. Now, he thought he won that one, but effectively, he marked it for all of history that it's right here. And so there's really little question we got the place. Now, by the way, they're doing new excavations on the tomb of Jesus right now. And I'm going to guarantee you, there are people down there looking for blood samples. Now, have you heard anything about it? Not yet. But I'm going to guarantee you they are looking feverishly to see what they can find. Why? Well, so that we can clone another Jesus. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I appreciate it. My great pleasure. Yeah. Yeah. Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Sepulchre meaning grave.